The brilliant economist Milton Friedman, whom I had the pleasure of once meeting and who wrote a blurb for one of my books, said there are 4 ways of spending money, from the most efficient to the least efficient. The most efficient is when you spend your own money on yourself. The second most efficient is when you spend your own money on somebody else you care about, like a daughter. The third way is when somebody spends his money on you, as when you have an expense account with your boss. You can't go crazy, otherwise you get fired. And the fourth most least efficient, least productive way of spending money is somebody else's money on somebody else. And that brings us to Elizabeth Warren and the cost of her health care plan. One more time, Senator Warren, who's going to pay and how much?
Will you raise taxes on the middle class to pay for it, yes or no?
So I have made clear what my principles are here, and that is costs will go up for the wealthy and for big corporations, and for hardworking middle-class families, costs will go down.
A yes or no question that didn't get a yes or no answer.
Let's try that again, shall we?
But isn't it a fact that the Bernie Sanders Medicare for All plan, which as of this moment you are on board with, right? Mm-hmm. It says quite specifically, middle class taxes will go up, correct?
So what Medicare for All describes is the kind of health care coverage we are going to provide as a country. The cost estimates on it are in lots of different places, and they vary by literally trillions and trillions of dollars, depending on how this lands. The same thing is true for the revenue streams. So where I am, and I think this is the right place to be, is to say, look, here's the commitment we need to make. It's a cost commitment.
Senator Warren, let's try this one more time. Actually, it's in your best interest to tell us who pays and how much.
Senator, on the question of costs for Medicare for All, you were asked about whether or not people's middle-class taxes would go up. You said their costs would go down, but can you address directly whether taxes like mine would go up under Medicare for All?
I'll say it again. Costs are going to go up for billionaires, they're going to go up for giant corporations, and out-of-pocket costs for middle-class families are going to go down. It's costs that matter. You know, keep in mind, I'm somebody who spent a big chunk of my life studying why people go broke. And a huge portion of those people go broke because of health care costs, and those are people who have health insurance. I talked tonight about Addie Barkin, somebody with really first-rate good health insurance, who still, month after month, has to spend about $9,000 to get the medical treatment his doctors and nurses say he needs. His wife spends hours on the phone begging the insurance company to cover him. And that's not what insurance companies are about. They're about taking in the most money that they can and paying out the least. We can't sustain a system like that. It sucked $23 billion in profits out last year. We just can't.
Senator Warren, work with me here.
God, help me. Help me, Rod. Help me. Help you.
So, how much and who pays?
The numbers are finally in. Senator Elizabeth Warren revealing her Medicare for All plan would cost, quote unquote, just under $52 trillion. That over the next decade, more than double the total U.S. national debt.
So there is a plan. Tax billionaires for that plan. How do billionaires feel about it?
And I don't need Elizabeth Warren telling me that I'm a deadbeat and that billionaires are deadbeats. The vilification of billionaires makes no sense to me. The world is a substantially better place because of Bill Gates, Michael Bloomberg, David Rubenstein, Bernie Marcus, Ken Langone. This is idiocy. This is appealing to the lowest common denominator and basically trying to turn people's heads around with promising a lot of free stuff.
All right, now we know. And when President Trump ran, he promised to replace Obamacare with something better.
With the Republican House and Senate, we will immediately repeal and replace the disaster known as Obamacare.
Repeal and replace? I'm a Trump supporter, but repeal and replace, I mentioned at the very start of this video, Milton Friedman says there are 4 ways to spend money. The least efficient way is somebody else's money on somebody else. That's exactly what Medicare for All is. That's exactly what Obamacare is. That's exactly what this march has always been from the very beginning for single payer. And it is inefficient. The real plan to replace Obamacare is something called free markets.
When you see around the globe the maldistribution of wealth, the desperate plight of millions of people in underdeveloped countries, when you see so few haves and so many have-nots, when you see the greed and the concentration of power within, did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea to run on?
Well, first of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed? You think Russia doesn't run on greed? You think China doesn't run on greed? What is greed? Of course, none of us are greedy. It's only the other fellow who's greedy. The world runs on individuals pursuing their separate interests. The great achievements of civilization have not come from government bureaus. Einstein didn't construct his theory under order from a bureaucrat. Henry Ford didn't revolutionize the automobile industry that way. In the only cases in which the masses have escaped from the kind of grinding poverty you're talking about, the only cases in recorded history are where they have had capitalism and largely free trade. If you want to know where the masses are worst off, it's exactly in the kinds of societies that depart from that. So that the record of history is absolutely crystal clear, that there is no alternative way so far discovered of improving the lot of the ordinary people that can hold a candle to the productive activities that are unleashed by a free enterprise system.
But it seems...
I mean, even rock star Bono understands that entrepreneurial capitalism, as he put it, is far, far better than welfare and lifts far more people out of poverty than any other kind of scheme ever has.
So some of Africa is rising and some of Africa is stuck. The question is whether the rising bit will pull the rest of Africa up or whether the other Africa will weigh the continent down. Which will it be? Stakes here aren't just about them. Imagine for a second this last global recession, but without the economic growth of China and India, without the hundreds of millions of newly minted middle-class folks who now buy American and European goods. Imagine that. Think about the last 5 years. Rockstar preaches capitalism. Wow. Sometimes I hear myself and I just can't believe it. But commerce is real. That's what you're about here. It's real. Aid is just a stopgap. Commerce, entrepreneurial capitalism takes more people out of poverty than aid. Of course, we know that.
But what about greed?
But it seems to reward not virtue as much as ability to manipulate the system.
And what does reward virtue? You think a communist commissar rewards virtue? You think a Hitler rewards virtue? You think, excuse me, if you'll pardon me, do you think American presidents reward virtue? Do they choose their appointees on the basis of the virtue of the people appointed or on the basis of their political clout? Is it really true that political self-interest is nobler somehow than economic self-interest? You know, I think you're taking a lot of things for granted. And just tell me where in the world you find these angels who are going to organize society for us.
Now back to Senator Warren. Just how many billionaires does she think we have? Are there enough to pay for her plan? Before her plan was unveiled, a cheaper $32 trillion plan was analyzed by the center-left publication called The Atlantic. Here's what they said. How big a lift is it to raise $32 trillion? It's almost 50% more than the total revenue the Congressional Budget Office projects Washington will collect from the personal income tax over the next decade. It's more than double the amount CBO projects Washington will collect over the next decade from the payroll tax that funds Social Security and part of Medicare. A $32 trillion tax increase would represent just over 2/3 of the revenue the CBO projects will collect from all sources over the next decade. End of quote.
She's making it up. She's making, look, nobody thinks it's $20 trillion. It's between $30 and $40 trillion. Every major independent study that's gone out there that's taken a look at this, there's no way, even Bernie, who talks about the need to raise middle class taxes, he can't even meet the cost of it.
But to Senator Warren, none of this matters because after all, it's about people.
So I've talked with the family, the mom and dad whose daughter's been diagnosed with cancer. I have talked to the young woman whose mother has just been diagnosed with diabetes. I've talked to the young man who has MS. And here's the thing about all of them. They all had great health insurance right at the beginning. But then they found out when they really needed it, when the costs went up, that the insurance company pulled the rug out from underneath them and they were left with nothing.
But the money isn't there, and it never will be there if government completely takes over our healthcare system, making it far less efficient and far less productive.
It's the free lunch myth. The belief that somehow or other government can spend money at nobody's expense. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of a wonderful description of government that was made by a French economist by the name of Frédéric Bastiat about 150 years ago. He said, government is that fiction whereby everybody believes that he can live at the expense of everybody else.
Now, speaking of free markets, I want to tell you about an incident I had on a plane ride recently. I sat next to a woman who lives in LA. She and her husband work in the entertainment industry, and they're both from Canada. I know, trifecta. And so we were talking about politics. She found out I was a Trump supporter. She, of course, is a hard lefty, and she couldn't imagine why we don't have Medicare for all. And I told her, you have a system like that in Canada. I used to live in Cleveland, and a bunch of Canadians would come to the Cleveland Center for health care. I saw that when I lived in Michigan. A bunch of people came down from Windsor because they were able to get MRIs that they weren't able to get in Canada. She was literally wincing as I said to her, healthcare is not a right. She winced when I said that. So then I told her, why is it that elective surgeries like hair grafts, like facelifts, and like LASIK surgery get cheaper and cheaper? I had LASIK surgery probably over 15 years ago, and it was far more expensive than it is today, and the quality is not as good as it is today. Same thing with facelifts, same thing with hair grafts. And she said, yes, but the key word is, you said elective. And I said, I meant elective because government's not involved, insurance companies not involved. It's just doctors competing against other doctors to deliver these services that people want. There's no reason why the same principles wouldn't apply to a heart surgery if you needed a heart surgery. The point is, without government, this sector of the healthcare industry has gotten more efficient, the prices have gone down, and the services have become more accessible. Literally, she was wincing. And finally, I said to her, how many conservative friends do you have? She goes, oh, I have several. I said, really? Have you ever had a conversation with a conservative like this? And she went, well, and it was obvious she hadn't. So many people on the left do not have any conservative friends. People like me living in LA and California, it is not possible to go through life without having liberal friends. But a bunch of people on the left do not have a single conservative friend, and I'm sure, and I'm confident that this woman had never had a conversation with anybody like me. But back to Senator Warren. Senator, the money isn't there. Government has no money. Government gets its money by taxing it, by printing it, or by borrowing it. It has no money of its own. Maybe we can get a banker to explain to her there isn't the money for the plan.
When we spend more per month or per year than we have in income, you must then dip into the capital, eventually exhausting the capital and, of course, therefore, the income. Do you see what I mean?
Mr. Beckett, this check must be paid.
Mr. Graham,
And at once.
I'm trying to explain to you that it is impossible to pay the check because your expenses have exceeded your income to such a point that you have exhausted your capital. Now you have no capital, no income, therefore no funds for the check, you see.
Don't treat me as though I were a child, Mr. Beckett.
No, I'm not.
I am as aware of what it means to have no capital as you are.
Oh, good. Good.
Now, what about this check?
Well, are you entirely sure that you really do understand what I mean by capital, Mr. Graham? You see, you've exhausted the capital. I can't cover the check because the check is for $6,000 and you don't have $6,000. In other words, you don't have $60.
Come to the point, Beckett.
The point, Mr. Graham, is that you don't have any money. The capital and the income are exhausted and you no longer have any money. I wish there was some other way I could say it. How could I put it? That money, you have no capital, you have no income, no, it's only money. No, you have no money.
I'm Larry Elder, and this has been The Larry Elder Show for Epic Times. See you next time.